Hello, everybody. This is Rational Vids. It's kind of early in the morning here, so my commentary might not be as accurate as you want it to be. It is currently, well, you can see the time on the right side of the screen. It's pretty warm and humid here in Texas. Today, I'm taking the 8 values test, and I know this is kind of a redundant sort of political video. I know a lot of YouTubers have already posted their political views, but in case you were wondering about what my views were, in case you decided to label me some sort of grifter for the right, since I criticize people on since I criticize the Democrats a lot, I am very critical. First of all, very critical of both parties. I'm critical of the Republicans because they are not only immoral when it comes to their economic positions. For example, their lack of support for universal health care is one of their most egregiously wrong moral positions of all time. But not unlike the corporate Democrats or even some of the progressive Democrats that don't fight for Medicare for all on the House floor. But they're also Republican social views are just abhorrent to me. I believe they side more with authority than the liberty they claim to support, other than their positions on gun rights. So, as a lefty, as an anti-authoritarian leftist, what are my 8 values tests? So, for those of you who are unfamiliar, the 8 values is a new form of political test that I personally believe is more accurate than the political compass test, because I think it gives you first of all, more detailed questions about your personal views, and also more detailed questions about more detailed axes. It's not just like a authoritarian versus libertarian axes or a left versus right axes. Sometimes authoritarianism and libertarianism sometimes don't reflect what your stances on diplomatic views are, such as you could be totally like a libertarian right, but be in support for Ukraine and the neo-Nazis bombing Donetsk and Luhansk. But you could also be libertarian, but still believing in like family values and societal tradition versus progress. So I think this is way more in depth, is what I would say. So you have the economic scale that they have. Equality represents those with higher equality scores believe that economies should distribute value evenly among the populace. They tend to support progressive tax codes, social programs, and high value socialism. You all know that I am a certified lefty, so I am definitely on the socialist side. And those who believe in markets obviously believe in the economy should be focused on rapid growth. They tend to support lower taxes, privatization, deregulation, and high values laissez-faire capitalism. Now, I tend to have a unique perspective on socialism, that it should be from the bottom up, not from the top down. It shouldn't be regulated all the time in these rigid bureaucratic structures. I think local level is important because you get to have the voice of the people controlling what they want socialism to look like in their own communities. You also have a more market, if you take the more, I hate to say the market-based approach, but rather sort of the freedom of choice in what you want to buy and get, like how the freedom of, price controlling how much you spend on money, how much money you spend on food, how much money you spend on essentials, and still have money left over for, miscellaneous expenses. I think there is a way you can implement socialism that reflects local control and local, workers' unions, local co-ops, connections between small banks rather than large centralized banks, such as I believe more in like credit unions rather than large corporate chains like Chase or Wells Fargo, or all these people that will just give out loans, not pretending not to worry about what that would do to inflation. The diplomatic axis is basically nation versus globe. Now, sometimes I believe this sort of axis is a little bit disingenuous because you can be more So it says here that those with higher nation scores are patriotic and nationalist. They often believe in an aggressive foreign policy, valuing the military strength, sovereignty, and high values territorial expansion. Now, I do not believe in an aggressive foreign policy. Um, I don't. I mean, military. Realistically, every country. Well, there are some countries that have actually abolished their military, but the ones that have are some of the ones that U.S. imperialism protects. Um, so there, realistically, a nation needs to have a line of defense to prevent foreign attacks, but at the same time, we shouldn't be going out and expanding and trying to be world police, and you know waging imperialism. Um, Territorial expansion is what the Nazis did. Colonialism and imperialism is what that is, and we practice a lot of that too, as well as some other countries around the world. Um, then there's globe. Those with higher globe scores are cosmopolitan and globalist. They often believe in peaceful foreign policy, emphasizing diplomacy, which I agree with, cooperation, integration, and high values of world government. I don't necessarily believe in a world government. A world government doesn't is not necessarily a good thing. I don't think a world government which manages the whole populace is going to reflect what the populace wants in separate areas. So the civil axis is an obvious one. Those with higher liberty scores tend to believe in civil liberties. They tend to support democracy, oppose state intervention in personal lives, which is one of my top priorities. But that this refers to civil liberties, not economic liberties. Authority, those with higher authority scores believe in strong state power. They tend to support state intervention in personal lives, government surveillance, and that high values censorship or autocracy. Very few people are actually going to say they are for this, but I know some people that have characteristics that they are for this. And then this last axis is the society scale. Um, Tradition versus progress. Tradition scores believe in traditional values, strict accordance to a moral code, though not always. They are usually religious and support the status quo or the status quo ante. These people tend to kind of, they can have their own views. It's not like these views can't exist, but they really do piss me off that they do exist. And then progress, those with higher progress scores believe in social change and rationality, yes. Though not always, they are usually secular or atheist, which I am definitely secular and pretty much atheist, and support environmental action and scientific or technological approach. So now that we've covered the four axes, let's start. You will be presented with a series of statements. For each one, click the button with your opinion on it. Okay, got it. 1 of 70, cool. Oppression by governments is more of a concern than oppression by corporations. You have to think about this within the context of when you think about this question, you have to think about it from the context of American versus world politics. Do I believe that oppression by corporations is a definite concern? Well, absolutely, especially in America. The corporations pretty much control the government here. The government has basically become an oligarchy controlled by a series of like maybe 10 or 15 corporations, which is not representing the people. So in a way, that is oppression by corporations because the two-party system is ultimately a fake duopoly. But oppression by government is also a real thing, and if corporations control the government, then the government can pass down laws that control society at an individualistic level, which is pretty terrifying to consider. And it can go the other way around too. Government can have ultimate power. In some places, as you've seen, like North Korea, it's just like you've seen what state government does there. You've seen how they just imprison anybody in like a fucking prison camp where they are most likely to die via state mandated execution and extra legal execution by North Korean authorities. And so you've seen both sides of the coin. I can't say that one is more oppressive than the other. They're both very equally oppressive, so I'm going to say neutral. It is necessary for the government to intervene in the economy to protect consumers. Yes, I believe this in principle. as to how the government intervenes in the economy to protect consumers, I think should be at least put into context. But to protect consumers is my primary thing. So I strongly agree. The freer the markets, the freer the people. Well, what is the definition of a free market according to this quiz? If free market equals capitalism, the capitalist system that we live under currently has not made people freer. It has made people the freedom from poverty and the freedom from fear is ultimately negated by the existence of this capitalist system. So what is a free market? If free market basically just means freedom of choice in what you want to consume and knowingly consume and buy, then that's okay with me. The problem is that this doesn't always apply. I mean, you've seen how the U.S. functions as a quote unquote democracy. But then you've seen how like places like Chile have tried to implement this tactic under dictatorships. Brazil has implemented some of these tactics under dictatorships, and I mean, so the freedom of the market is ultimately negated by the power structures that be. So I've seen Republicans, for example, be all about free markets, except when it comes to the resources that they don't want you to buy, such as elite, such as guns, or such as cannabis, or such as other useful alternative medicines that big pharma doesn't want you to consume. So ultimately, I am going to be neutral or disagree, or both. I slightly disagree with that. It is better to maintain a balanced budget than to ensure welfare for all citizens. No, in a country as rich as ours, I don't give a shit how balanced the budget is. Ensuring welfare for all citizens should be your number one priority. Publicly funded research is more beneficial to the people than leaving it to the market. I think you could do publicly or private funded research. But when it comes to like things like big pharma, though, big pharma is ultimately enabled by publicly funded research done at universities and done at done at labs, CDC labs. Ultimately, Pfizer markets its products after capitalizing off of patents. So I think it's publicly funded research is way more beneficial than leaving it to the market, because once the market starts to research on something, they start to make a patent on it, and they completely have a monopoly on that purchase. This is how big pharma scams people out of their goddamn money. So I agree with this. Tariffs on international trade are important to encourage local production. I have not always heard that tariffs help, but I think if used, so tariffs like any other trade tool can be a tool, or any other tool, they can be used for good or they can be used for bad. I think overall, restrictions on international trade and corporate outsourcing are very good things to encourage local production. We don't even make our own shit anymore. So I think I would strongly agree with this. From each according to his ability to each according to his needs is a fundamental Marxist principle that should be abided at every fucking level of government. It would be best if social programs were abolished in favor of private charity. So I have no problem with charity. Charity can help. But it is disingenuous to believe that charity can fully replace a social program. I understand that there's some problems with our social programs as it is. They currently enable people to be poorer rather than to help people, rather than to help the needy. So I don't think abolishing these programs are good. Reforming these programs is good. Abolishing them in favor of private charity is something I wouldn't agree with. Taxes should be increased on the rich to provide for the poor. Yes, indeed. Inheritance is a legitimate form of wealth. Rarely. And I mean very rarely. If you have an inheritance, you should be expected to contribute some of that inheritance since you didn't even work for it. Okay? Like, I don't believe that inheritance is legitimate. Basic utilities like roads and electricity should be publicly owned. Yeah, absolutely. Government intervention is a threat to the economy. No, no, not always. Because when it depends on how much regulation there is. If there's too over regulation on like a single product, then that can lead to some pretty disastrous consequences. However, government regulations on the efficacy of products or the efficacy of corporate practices is a good thing. I think it can be used to an advantage and ultimately actually do the opposite effects of what this question is stating. It can actually stimulate the economy in some cases. So, and it depends on how much intervention there is, by the way. So, I guess it would depend. Neutral. Those with a greater ability to pay should receive better healthcare. No, 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 no. Everybody should receive the same quality of healthcare. It does not fucking matter whether you are rich or whether you are poor. Everyone gets healthcare. It does not fucking matter. Quality education is a right of all people. Well, yes, to have an educated populace is something that should be a priority in this country. If we have an uneducated populace, that tends to breed ignorance, and ignorance leads to fear, and fear leads to hatred. So, the means of production should belong to the workers who use them. Absolutely. The workers are the ones spending their daily lives making the products for the wealthy capitalists. So more transfer of democratization of the workplace is something I do believe in. The United Nations should be abolished. The United Nations, the UN was formed at a time where just after World War II, when we saw war ravaged Europe, there was fascism and very far right nationalism in places like Germany and Italy and Japan that threatened world peace. And the United Nations was set in there to regulate was sent there to be a diplomatic sort of resolution that the U.S. helped create. But the thing is that the United Nations in recent years has not really been that effective in helping to establish any sort of world regulations. Any treaty that the UN publishes is ultimately looked at as just like a piece of paper to another nation. Like Russia and China are both or Russia was formerly on UN councils, and they never respected one goddamn treaty signed by any of these people. So, and then there's the UN regulations on drugs, and that prevents a lot of meaningful reform on drug decriminalization. So, as an institution, the United Nations is effectively worthless. Do I think it should be abolished? I think it should be used. I think it should have more. If the United Nations doesn't have any more influence, then I kind of agree it should be. But I'm unsure about that. Military action by our nation is often necessary to protect it. Military action. What do you mean? Do you mean just defending our borders here at home, or defending our shores from offshore invaders? I mean, that's just a primary necessity. But what do you mean, like intervention and shit like that, and going into other countries when there's intervening in other conflicts and sending all of our taxpayer money over there rather than helping the citizens here with healthcare? I don't think so. I'm going to say strongly disagree. The way we do this right now is not good. I support regional unions such as the European Union. Regional unions some are also sort of effectively meaningless. Every resolution published by the EU, I mean, in some cases, the EU has been pretty helpful in Europe with helping to raise human rights standards in European countries. But has it been enough? And, some of these regional unions, or much like world governments, can sort of threaten people's sense of a community. And that threat leads to this sort of toxic nationalism that you're seeing in a lot of European countries like now, such as Hungary, such as Poland, such as Spain, such as France, such as Austria. So I think setting up regional unions like this is not very helpful. It is important to maintain our national sovereignty. Yeah, I agree. To maintain our stance as a country to help our own citizens is something, our own citizens first, is something, and immigrants as well, is something that we should have. We should go about it better, but I think we should maintain it. A united world government would be beneficial to mankind. No, 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 no. See, a united world government would be inherently bureaucratic. It would be dominated either by a bunch of billionaires who want to control what the populace believes and thinks, or it would be led by a bunch of backwards, or a bunch of, not backwards, but people in different cultures who see like our ways of life as inherently immoral, but dictating it from another country on this. No, this would be completely chaotic. No, it wouldn't. It is more important to retain peaceful relations than to further our strength. Well, yes, obviously. I mean, diplomacy is good over war. So, wars do not need to be justified to other countries. Yes, they do. Yes, they do. Military spending is a waste of money. The way we do it now is a waste of money. International aid is a waste of money. It depends on the way you're doing it. Like, are you letting the countries determine how that money gets used, or are you trying to be trying to be neo-colonizers and basically saying, oh, we're going to control how this money gets spent? I understand some governments are corrupt and they mismanage money, but the thing is, they're ultimately corrupt because we made those governments corrupt. Okay, so that's what the British Empire did to many of their countries. They dominated and colonized for years. They left those governments after the decolonization movements in the 50s and 60s. Those governments were already affected by the ways that British and European colonial supremacy had on their populace. They maintained some of these outdated barbaric laws on homosexuality, which prescribes punishments up to death in some cases. It's obviously, that's obviously wrong. It came from this sort of moralistic, outdated perspective from the UK and most of the Commonwealth nations. And the way the US did imperialism in places like the Philippines and Cuba ultimately led them to revolts. I think international aid can be used. Now, on the context of international aid, sometimes it's necessary. Do I think it's a waste of money completely? Not really, but it depends on how we do it. I think more of that money can be used to aid citizens who are already impoverished here in places like West Virginia and the inner cities, and places out in the rural areas that don't have a lot of economic resources. So you need to understand that we have people struggling here at home before we even focus on the people struggling offshores. So I'm going to be neutral. My nation is great. We got a lot of shit to work on. Neutral. Actually, research should be conducted on an international scale. Agree? Yeah, of course. Government should be accountable to the international community. I think so. I think there should be some sort of consensus that we don't want another dictatorship forming in another country, or when an election goes awry or something, there should be like some sort of election commission that investigates. Now, does not promote military action or interference in those countries, but should definitely there should definitely be a standard for upholding human rights around the world. So I agree with this. Even when protesting an authoritarian government, violence is not acceptable. I used to be this way. I used to be the guy who was like, violence is always wrong. It continues an endless cycle of bloodshed. But when the but and I still agree with that to a certain extent. I was a very I'm as a person who has that sort of bohemian hippie mentality. I do believe that pacifism in diplomacy is ultimately better. But when you're protesting against the but when you're going against a power structure that ultimately doesn't want you to have any rights at all, treats you like your cattle with a number attached to you, and doesn't give you any rights at all, and suppresses your right to peacefully protest, what do you do? What's left? What the hell is left after that? The people of countries like Belarus should be uprising against their own government because peaceful protesters get arrested all the time in these countries. I kind of disagree when it comes to that point. Violence is sometimes the ultimately inevitable consequence of an authoritarian government being a shitty authoritarian government. So my religious values should be spread as much as possible. No. Our nation's values should be spread as much as possible. Also, I don't believe in, so I don't believe in religious colonization, and I don't believe in national colonization. This sort of Americanization around the world, what has it led to? Really nothing. Really nothing substantial for their people, so it is very important to maintain law and order. Now, this is one of those sort of buzzword questions, because what is law and order? Is law and order basically is law and order basically the saying we have a system of laws and we just abide by the laws that are laid out? But then again, don't we have rights as citizens in a free country to question the laws in place? We have laws, we can overturn the laws we disagree with, and there are some laws that people do not fucking care about, and they shouldn't care about because they're immoral laws, such as the prohibition on cannabis or the prohibition of just drug use that doesn't harm anybody else. People ultimately use drugs every day. They don't give a fuck about the laws in place because the laws don't prevent what goes on. Even if the laws have these, because some people like police officers believe that harsh punishments in the laws ultimately deter people from using drugs, which is such a backwards, outdated mentality. And it's not even true because you've seen how high our drug use rates in America are, right? Compared to even many European countries, we have a very high rate of drug use and opioid overdose. It is the laws in place do not prevent people from using drugs. That is just such an outdated, fucking stupid argument. And it's propped up by the police organizations and big pharma. Now, when it comes to law and order in general, we obviously don't want, people going around murdering or looting or, raping each other on a daily basis without consequence. There should still be consequences and penalties for behavior that violates people's natural born rights. If you go after me and harm me, I would expect consequences to be laid out for you. But if you are doing something that doesn't harm anybody, then I wouldn't have any problem with it. So, sometimes, but this sort of law and order phrase that's used by conservatives in the thin blue line is ultimately enhancing the police state overall. So in this case, law and order, I would disagree. The general populace makes poor decisions. You have to look at this from a realistic perspective. People will be people. Humans will be humans. We make dumb mistakes all the time. Okay? But we also make the right decisions a lot of the times. And I think if the general populace of America, when polled issue for issue, is actually okay. It's not bad. We still want universal health care. We want drug decriminalization. We care about the rights of all people, including the rights of sexual minorities. We care about people, I think, overall. Does that mean we always make the right decisions? No. But I'm going to be neutral on this. This physician-assisted suicide should be legal. Yes, I don't know why people should think that's still illegal. Even my religious mom believes that physician-assisted suicide should be legal. It's the more merciful way of putting somebody out of their misery. You know, I don't know whether these Christians believe that, oh, euthanasia is inherently wrong, even on like somebody's deathbed. Like, would you rather them suffer in an old person's home, being treated to lack of sunlight? Absolutely not. Yes, I believe it should be legal. The sacrifice of some civil liberties is necessary to protect us from acts of terrorism. No, civil liberties are most important, and you can't take them away from us. And if you try to take them away from us under any pretense, we will rebel. So fuck that. Government surveillance is necessary in the modern world. No. Do I believe surveillance is necessary for like just to spot out people like looting somebody's car in the back of a parking lot? I mean, just to spot out like obvious crime like that. Like obviously sometimes, but that's ultimately up to an entity like a individual entity to implement surveillance. I don't think government surveillance is necessary. The very existence of the state is a threat to our liberty. This is an anarchist perspective, and I want to be clear that the existence of the state sometimes, I mean, it is somewhat a threat to our liberty, isn't it? Because the state is a power, ultimately, at the end of the day, a power structure made up of individuals who were put there either by election or by appointment. And these people have say over what goes on legally in our country. So our liberties are ultimately up to the whim of these people who are making the decisions. And that should scare you. But at the same time, without the state, what do we? I mean, without like at least like a structure to hold in place at least some of the what I believe in is that and what Marxism believes in is that ultimately we will be in a system, in a stateless society that is hierarchicalist and kind of respects each other mutually on a one-to-one basis as human beings, not as assets of whether you are part of the state or whether you are not. So in a way, I agree with this. I kind of, but I also, I'm going to be neutral. Regardless of political opinions, it is important to side with your country. No, that would be a stupid thing to say. If you actually gave a shit about your country, then you would actually oppose it when it does something wrong. So, no. All authority should be questioned. Well, duh. A hierarchical state is best. No, it's not, because a hierarchical state puts people on higher and lower categories, and the people on the lower categories are ultimately the ones that are dehumanized. So, no. It is important that the government follows the majority opinion, even if it is wrong. So sometimes majority opinion is wrong on definite like issues. When majority opinion is wrong on stuff like civil rights and civil liberties, then you should not follow the opinion of the majority, because the majority is ultimately going to be, in that case, stupid about those issues or ignorant about those issues, or both. But when it comes to kitchen table economic issues from the majority opinion, I think those should be voted on. But when it comes to essential fundamental rights that need to be protected, the people shouldn't just get to vote to take away rights, for example, from African Americans or from gays or from transgender people. You can't allow that to happen, because those rights are protected and enshrined under a moral position that we care about all people. So I believe in direct democracy, but there's some things that should be off the table when it comes to fundamental liberties and rights that need to be preserved. They shouldn't just be taken away by politicians or taken away by a vote. But at the same time, I think when it does come to something like, oh, we want to legalize cannabis, or we would like to decriminalize psychedelics, or we would like to legalize psychedelics or decriminalize the use of any other drug. That's the majority opinion in this country. The government's not following it, and it pisses a lot of people off. the majority of the public wants universal health care. The government's not implementing it. So we should leave that up to the voters. So I do agree in this sense. The stronger the leadership, the better. Stronger the leadership, the better. So this kind of question I don't think is worded right, because a strong leader is not the same as an authoritarian strong man. Like, an authoritarian strong man, obviously you wouldn't want like somebody who's like an iron fist dictator trying to control the populace in their lives. But at the same time, would you want a weak, feckless leader like, I don't know, like Biden, who's just refuses to act on anything and refused to live up to any of the promises he made on his campaign? What we need, when I say strong leader, I mean strong in their convictions, strong in their willingness to get things done. We elected you to be in that office so you could get things done, not so you could just prance around the Oval Office like a fucking idiot and go about like, oh, Ukraine. I think, Ukraine, Jack. I think strong leadership is ultimately, you need somebody who's determined and willful to do things. But you don't want an authoritarian strongman. Yes, I agree with this. But the way this question is worded is so, like, it makes me want to give a neutral answer, because I don't believe in a dictator, but I don't believe in a weak leader either. Democracy is more than a decision-making process. Well, yes, democracy is a way of life. That's like, when it comes to, freedom of speech, freedom of press, respect for all people, no matter who they are, living in a society where you can vote and where you can peacefully protest. I mean, democracy is a part of like who we are. It's a social fabric. It needs to be respected. It's way more than just decision making process. Environmental regulations are essential. Yes, absolutely, especially these days. A better world will come from automation, science, and technology. Well, here's the thing. I believe in the progression of science and technology, but I'm also concerned with what people do with technology. Are people ready to accept, like, like, for example, I've seen social media be used in all sorts of nefarious purposes because the people don't know how to react to disseminated information. They come with it from a perspective like, oh, if I receive this information, therefore I have to act in this way. Because of those people who are because the TikTok influencers are ultimately right people. You can't disagree with the TikTok influencers, right? Like, there is a way that people manipulate technology. And after watching Black Mirror and shows like it, and watching our civilization unravel because we've become so radicalized by the dogma we hear from the media, on, for example, like, there are a lot of like transphobic things being said on TikTok that people just receive, and they don't even know how to take it any other way than, I should hate transgender people. It's wrong. Like, the way that people use technology in order to benefit their own purposes. Automation will ultimately hurt like the working class if used wrong, because you've seen how big corporate businesses want to automatize every one of their workforces. They want robot waiters. They want robot people, robots in the warehouses. They want robots everywhere else. This is why it ultimately comes out of a profit-driven want for efficiency, and it's wrong. So, but if so, this is not me opposing technology. I'm not some sort of Luddite, but from a perspective that technology should be used in the right ways. So I'm going to be neutral here. Children should be educated in religious or traditional values. No, I don't think that children should be indoctrinated with organized religion. Sorry. Traditions are of no value on their own. What do you mean of no value on their own? What the hell is this question? I have no idea what you're trying to ask me. Traditions are of no value on their own. So are you saying traditions only have value when everybody participates in it? I thought tradition is what tradition is basically an is the ritualistic aspect of culture. It's what is practiced. It's a as part of a culture. So believe that there are some traditions that are good, but there are some traditions that are bad too. Like there is a tradition of anybody who commits a quote unquote offense in a, let's say, a country with very religious laws gets stoned to death. That's a tradition that I think is very abhorrent and morally wrong. But and what I believe, the retribution that some people in organized religion believe, I think is ultimately the morally wrong position to take. People just get what they deserve without any context as to the severity of the quote unquote offense they have committed. So, but there are good traditions like holidays. People were, when people celebrate things and take the time off and do things on their own. But are traditions effectively meaningless? This is a good question. I have no idea, though. Religion should play a role in government. Absolutely fucking not. We do not want a theocracy. The separation of church and state is essential to a thriving democracy. Churches should be taxed the same way other institutions are taxed. It depends on the size of the church. I know churches provide, like, I'm not religious at all, but I believe there are some things that churches do that do help people at least feel like they belong to something. People that give people a sense of purpose. I believe that's a good thing. When it comes to like small rural churches, I mean, without much funding, I don't think these people like these places. I think serve a sense of community in these small rural places. What I do have a problem with, though, is mega churches making disavowing every principle of what they propose to believe in the sense of profit-driven schemes and grifts. That's what mega churches are ultimately like the devil's work. If that's what if they should be viewed as the devil's work among Christians. I hate fucking mega churches and televangelists who go on and try to prophesize our forecoming doom because we tolerate homosexuality. Like, it's so stupid, but so I believe the mega churches should be taxed for goddamn sure. Should the small churches be taxed? That's up to the people. Climate change is currently one of the greatest threats to our way of life. Yes. It is important that we work as a united world to combat climate change. Yes, there's no other way to do it, really. I mean, one individual country cannot just combat climate change. It needs to be a concerted global effort because we're dealing with a global problem. Society was better many years ago than it is now. In some ways, I guess better in that there's more liberties afforded to sexual minorities and marginalized racial groups than it is like now than back then. But then again, back then we didn't have a lot of regulations on drug use. But now we have people being locked up for a little bit of weed or a little bit of cocaine. Like, they're not dealers, but they get locked up anyway. There's more bureaucratic regulation. We're pretty much in the same economic dichotomy as we were back then. We're living essentially through a second Gilded Age in the United States, where there's a huge concentration of massive wealth at the top and just crumbs for the rest of us. I mean, it's just not. I mean, in some cases, society is the same as it's always been. In some cases, we've progressed with our level of technology and our cultural values and our understanding that make it a bit better than it was back then. But I don't agree it was better many years ago. I think it's always been kind of like the same. It is important that we maintain the traditions of our past. Maintain the traditions of our past. Depends on the tradition. It is important that we think in the long term beyond our lifespans. Well, yeah, if you give a shit about your kids, then yes. Reason is more important than maintaining our culture. Well, yes, reason should be ultimately number one thing, more than important than maintaining our culture. Drug use should be legalized or decriminalized. Well, absolutely. This is like one of my number one things I'm fighting for right now. So, yeah. Same-sex marriage should be legal. Yes. No cultures are superior to others. Wait. This is a question about moral relativism. Yeah, I don't believe that there is one culture that is superior to another. We in the West like to believe that we're so enlightened than people like in like Muslim countries or people in like Africa or people in East Asia. We like to think we're like we're the beacon of liberty, a shining light, even though we have a lot of fucking problems we have to deal with here as well. No, and when it comes to human nature, there's not really a culture that's superior to ours. Our laws may look more progressive than laws in like Saudi Arabia, but the thing is, we can ultimately end up that way if we have people who are very with ill wills. So I don't think there is an argument to be made that culture is only based on culture is based on basically where humans are at a certain point in time, or a certain point in or a certain geography. There's no culture that is ultimately superior. I wouldn't call the cultures that are isolated from the rest of the world and still, survive on hunting and gathering as inferior to us. They've just never been exposed to modern technology. That doesn't mean their culture is inferior, though. So, because maybe they have their own ways of doing things that would be considered progressive to us. Who knows, right? So I agree with this statement. Sex outside marriage is immoral. No, no, no. There's a difference between sex and love. Sex is ultimately driven by, I like the way you look. I like the physical features and aspects of what you look like. While love is motivated by, I want to have a personal connection with that person. There's no sex outside marriage, sex before marriage or whatever. There is nothing about that as immoral. What are we living in the 1950s? Why is this still a thing? If we accept migrants at all, it is important that they assimilate into our culture. Ooh, this is a tough one. Because ultimately, something Kyle Kalinske believes in controversially is that migrants should at least accept basic aspects of what are our ways of life and how we do things, so we don't go into a state where we're demonizing people because they're gay, or demonizing people because they are of a different race, or demonizing people because they are a different nationality, or whatever the hell you believe. Migrants need to accept some basic principles. They can retain certain aspects of their culture, though. Without that, we wouldn't have any cultural diversity. Cultural diversity is something that I think is a good thing, but and it helps us be educated as to what is out there, not just to what one American culture, of course. So assimilation, I'm not sure is the right word for it. Abortion should be prohibited in most or all cases. As a leftist, I don't think it should be prohibited. I don't think it's. I think there'd be regular. Now, I've always been a moderate when it comes to abortion, and this is not just me. There are a lot of other people on the left who would say, "I don't care about abortion," or "I don't," or at least I don't have the extreme pro-choice or pro-life dichotomy that people want to always paint this in. I am not so pro-life that I would ban abortion completely or even restrict it that much. But I am not pro-choice that I would allow it for partial birth reasons. Ultimately, I think it should be up to the woman to decide this. I I would disagree that it should be prohibited in most or all cases. Gun ownership should be prohibited for those without a valid reason. No. As Marx said, those who try to take guns away from the workers should be waged war upon in the most serious way. In fact, I can look up the Marx quote for you. Under no pretext should arms and ammunition be surrendered. Any attempts to disarm the people must be frustrated by force if necessary. Gun ownership and the right to defend oneself. I'm sorry. To all the fucking Democrats who are like, gun control is a popular issue right now, think about it this way. Would you want the government coming into your house and threatening you at gunpoint to do something because the only ones who are allowed to own guns are the government? Do you seriously believe that? Do you seriously believe, if anybody is a true follower of Marx, they would be for self-defense. And as an anti-authoritarian, this is especially important. So, no, I strongly disagree. I support single-payer universal health care. Yes, of course. Prostitution should be illegal. I don't think... So, here's my view on prostitution. Prostitution, if it were a legal, regulated industry, would get rid of all the black market elements. Much like if I think I legalize weed, would get rid of all the black market elements. However, there are some cases where I think that prostitutes are exploited by their pimps. And the pimps, I ultimately think... So the people buying and selling sex on its own should be decriminalized. But those who run like an industry and have connections to like human trafficking organizations should definitely be investigated. I don't think it should be illegal, but I think it should be decriminalized, but there's some caveats there. Maintaining family values is essential. So what are family values? Values are different from family to family, okay? There's no one family value, okay? There's no one family values. Conservatives like to paint this as like a monolithic picture. There is no one family value. And family values is sort of a buzzword for let's take away rights from LGBTQ people. So, no, sorry. Strongly disagree. To chase progress at all costs is dangerous. Not all the time. Not all the time. To chase progress is actually a good thing. I think some people should be allowed to maintain some aspects to preserve historically preserve some things in the case of maintaining some cultural aspects, as long as those cultural aspects are good aspects. But to claim that it's dangerous is something I'm not entirely in agreement with. Genetic modification is a force for good, even on humans. So this is an example of where science could go a little bit too far. Genetic modification, sometimes on humans, like humans need to learn that there is no purity, okay? Trying to focus on genetic modification in order to exact purity is not something we should be encouraging, because it only encourages the dehumanization of those who have not had genetic modification. So, is it a force for good? I don't think it's a force for good or evil. It could be like any other technology. It can be used. It can be used for good or evil. And when it's done to humans, it's like, when it's done to humans, everybody has to strive to be this perfect, Superman. I mean, I'm sorry. This could go disastrously. We should open our borders to immigration. Yeah, I agree. Governments should be as concerned about foreigners as they are about their own citizens. No. I'm sorry. Governments need to focus on the problems that their own citizens face first before they get concerned about what people in other countries are dealing with. Fuck. How is this a hard question for some people? All people, regardless of factors like culture or sexuality, should be treated equally. Well, yes. It is important that we further my group's goals above all others. No, that's a tribalistic notion. I don't believe in tribalism. So here are my results. I am 88.5% socialist, 71.1% globalist in the sense of that term, 82.8% libertarian, which is something I'm definitely I've definitely always emphasized, and 82.4% in favor of progress. So I'm a libertarian socialist overall. That's good. I'm liking this designation. Thanks for watching this video. I don't know how long this has gone on, guys. Thank you for watching this whole way through and learning my own values. But in case anybody thought I was a right-wing grifter, this is what I truly believe in. So, libertarian socialism, or anti-authoritarian socialism, as I would say.